We're delighted that this is a program that's put together by Ole Miss faculty members who have historically put together some of our best programs. Cynthia Joyce, the editor of the new anthology Please Forward, How Blogging Reconnected New Orleans After Katrina, will be our moderator for today's panel, and I'll let her introduce the panel in just a moment. But first, let me mention that our next program will be September the 9th at 5:30 p.m. It'll be a documentary on the amazing career of Mississippi newspaper reporter Bill Miner. Thank you, Cynthia. It's all yours.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Bill Rose and Curtis, for letting us put on this program today. We just came off a big 10th year anniversary of Katrina, which I think there's a lot of people on the coast who are sort of recovering from PTSD, I guess it would be, from having to relive all of the stuff. So there's been a ton of stuff in the news and in the media, but we are actually really fortunate to have a lot of in-house expertise here with us today to talk about both coverage back at the event itself, but then also revisiting that story to talk about that. But before we start, I wanted to ask really quickly, how many of you all here have a personal story or were touched directly by Katrina? I know a lot of people here probably, yes, do. So at least half of you here have some kind of story where that storm had an impact on your life directly. And how many of you thought that the anniversary coverage, that the media did a good job with the anniversary coverage? Nobody? Oh my gosh. Well, you'll see some work now, actually, that maybe will change your mind. Okay, well, I'll introduce these guys. So I'll introduce them quickly, and we're just going to go down the line and let you all kind of explain some of the work that you've done and what your relationship to the story is. Assistant Professor Alysia Steele is an award-winning, everybody here is award-winning, by the way, so I'll skip the rest of it. Is a multimedia journalist. In 2005, she was a photo editor at the Dallas Morning News, which was awarded a Pulitzer Prize in breaking news for their Hurricane Katrina photography coverage. We'll come back to her in just one second. Joe York is a documentary filmmaker whose recent short film, Room 10, which was published by Garden & Gun magazine, is that right? It traces what happened to 10 former students who were in the 3rd grade at New Orleans' Phyllis Wheatley Elementary School when Katrina struck. And then Dr. Nancy Dupont, right here, is a Gulf Coast native, a longtime broadcast journalist. She was a 2010 fellow of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma. Was that about Katrina?
Well, I actually was accepted because of Katrina, but it wasn't about Katrina.
Okay. Well, she recently led a student trip examining the Gulf or the Mississippi coast a decade after Hurricane Katrina killed more than 200 people there and caused total devastation in the coastal counties. So thank you guys for being here today. And we are going to start with, if I can pull back up my photos, Al Steele is going to talk to us a little bit about her experience as a photo editor at the Dallas Morning News in 2005.
Okay. Hi. So I had been working at the Dallas Morning News for 2 months when Katrina hit. And my job as the night photo editor was to look at all of the pictures for the entire paper, every section, and approve of them. And I've been watching the news, and it was 3 days before Katrina hit. And I called the director of photography and I said, I think Katrina is going to be worse than we expected. I think we need to send people there sooner. And he said, you're on the desk, make a decision. So I called staff to see who would be willing to make the trek to New Orleans. That was where I thought we needed to go first. And I'm not going to start with the first photo, but I'm going to start with, there was a big debate. When you enter pictures for a Pulitzer Prize, there's 20 pictures. And they all must be published. And when you have staff who are covering live events, there are picture editors and other editors who are deciding on the pictures that you will see. And when we did our entry, we got into a big fight with what picture to enter. And this was the photo I fought for. And I just wonder if anybody can tell me what you see in that picture or what kind of meaning you get from that picture. Does anybody see anything of what the people might be trying to tell you? Help. Yes, obviously. They're on the roof. Anything about the flags? Yes. Those are both valid points. I saw a lot of African Americans suffering through Katrina. I know a lot of people did. But I saw this as we're still Americans too. That's the way I saw it with the flags. And I think that's another good reason to have diversity on a staff. The director of photography fought for the other photo, which is over here. He was concerned with how did this guy get on this roof without a leg? And he's a big guy. And so there's a whole staff arguing over the photos, and in the end we decided to go with the flag, which was the first photo I showed you, because it just had that symbolic American, we can't believe this is happening on American soil kind of image. So I just wanted to talk about those two pictures and why there was a debate over them. And you can go.
Can you all see that, by the way? Do we need to?
So I need to point out the guy in the red is missing a leg, and he has his crutches there, and there's a hole right here by the crutch. And I think that's how, well, they climbed up through there. But my boss really liked the storytelling of, asking this question of how did he get up there. And I thought it was more important to talk about we're still Americans. We're still believing in our country and waving the flag. So that was the debate. We ended up using the flag photo.
Now, what days, do you remember what days these were published? No.
Probably the first week. Most of the pictures that we entered were from the first week.
And you were on the photo desk. How many photographers did you actually get going on this story?
We had 25 photographers, I think, and we had 15 to 18 of them out in the field. We all rotated, all of the picture editors. We worked 6 days a week, about 16 hours. And one person was in charge of the photo desk for photos going to the wire, which I did a lot of. Another person was in charge of sports. Another person was in charge of the front page. Another person was in charge of photo pages related to Katrina. So we had 7 picture editors, and we all had different duties per day. And then the photographers would take gas and food and drive, and then take gas for the next person, and then we would rotate them out, kind of like what we did. I wasn't there, but for Iraq, you would send some photographers in, send some back, because they had a lot of stress covering this, and I can talk about that later if you'd like.
Yeah, well, did you want to go through the photos? Or
yes, can we just go through them? There's one picture in particular that is very hard to see. I apologize for that, but that's the reality of what happened with Katrina. So the other thing that we kept seeing, and I know I talk about this in my photojournalism classes, is we're not just photographers, we are reporters. And a lot of pictures that were coming back from Katrina were showing that people were looting. And we had one photographer, Irwin. He wanted to see if people were looting, so he sat and waited. And the caption on this photo is this gentleman is going into a store, and he just gets one shirt. And Irwin says, you had the whole store there. Everybody's talking about everybody looting. Those are the images that people were showing. He said, I only needed one shirt. I needed to protect myself against the weather. So we're also dealing with images that show some blacks looting while whites were finding food. So that was another thing that we were trying to talk to people about.
So when you were having these discussions, like, were you making the decision of what to run, or were you having to fight for were you having to fight for certain images?
No, the only pictures we had to have a discussion about, I mean, the Dallas Morning News at that time, it's been a long time since I've been there, the culture was very respectful of photo and what the photo editors brought to the table, and they trusted our judgment. I remember when I first started working there, they're like, you're the photo editor, you got hired for a reason, make the decision. You stand with it or you fall with it. So,
do you want me to move on to the next one?
So this is a photo that Irwin took, and Irwin is award-winning. He's deputy director of photography now, and he came back with some serious stress. And this photo in particular, because it reminded him of his grandmother. And that talks about, you know, being a journalist and covering the event and trying to keep your emotions to yourself. But he had serious issues with this woman. She ended up living, but it was very traumatic for him. And this was one that we entered too.
What did you all do? I mean, this kind of touches on a subject of when, I think with the story of Katrina in particular, a lot of journalists ended up being first responders because there was such a slow response. And that became a real issue of sort of, you know, an ethical quandary too for people to say, well, do I respond to the situation at hand, or am I just here to document it? And also when journalists sort of become part of the story too, I think, when suddenly they are there sort of suffering through some of the same things, like the heat and the lack of resources and spending the night in their cars or whatever. So I don't know if you have thoughts or comments on that, or what was sort of, did things change after that in terms of how you guys dealt with things, or had there been kind of a plan in place?
I don't know if there was a plan in place to help people. I know that some of the photographers did. I know that they photographed things and then helped. It's kind of like I always think about Dr. King when people were covering the civil rights, and he said to a photographer, I don't need you to help, I need you to cover what's happening right now. But I think you have to respond as a human being, whatever your nature is. But we wouldn't have these pictures if we didn't document them first to show the depth of devastation. So, but I know that we offered counseling to all the photographers when they came back. We needed to.
All right, I'm going to pull up the next one. So this is, you kind of gave a consumer advisory on this one, but this is a tough image to see. Well,
yeah, that one, well, this one's good. This one's by Irwin too. I know students who have had me for 375 know, or hopefully will remember what the story was about. But I always ask students, what do you think this guy did? This is the second day of Katrina. What do you get from this photo? What message? What do you think he did? Okay, let me start with how many police officers do you see? Okay, there's 4 police officers. How many guns can you see? There's at least 3. Okay, what do you think he did? Forget about political correctness. What do you think he did?
Something bad.
Like what? What comes to your mind? Obviously, it's something bad. What? He killed someone. You said that? Okay. He had an open container of beer on day 2 of Katrina. And I'm sitting there wondering, is that really what your energy should be spent on? That was another image that we were showing. He had an open container of beer, which, so that was it. This is in Pass Christian, Mississippi.
That's Christian.
Pass Christian. This is Smiley Pool's photo. This was the same week. Smiley Pool had the foresight to get a helicopter with AP, and he kept the helicopter for 2 weeks or so, and they would go report, go back to another, like a fire station or somewhere where it was a little bit safer, and then go back, and he did this for 2 weeks, and then we had to eventually rotate him with someone else who became very tired. But the devastation, Mississippi was hit obviously just as hard as New Orleans, so we had photographers in Mississippi, Gulfport, and as well as New Orleans, and some other areas of Louisiana.
what is that?
That was an apartment complex and a swimming pool. I forgot how many units. That was the very first image that we ran when I told you that I was working the night desk and we made the decision to send Irwin. This was the very first photo the day before. That's 10 miles west of New Orleans.
It's a roof
That's a roof.
of this building here. No.
And just more photos from Irwin of covering. People were laying on the interstate roads. She didn't have any more water. He ended up giving her water. He was walking. Irwin and a lot of the photographers slept on their car, not inside their car, because people were breaking windows to get inside cars. So he slept on the roof of his car. another photo from Smiley Pool. That is an aerial of New Orleans. That was also the first week. Those are homes, the roofs of homes. And the last picture is kind of hard. This was Smiley's photo, and people left their pets, and there were dead bodies everywhere, and dogs started to eat dead bodies. And this picture was one that we went to the publisher and said, we need to publish this because people need to see what's happening. And the Dallas Morning News ended up publishing a book that had very limited, I think they only did like 3,000 prints. And it's a book full of images that were never published. But we fought for that photo. It ran inside, like 1.5 columns, black and white, because when you enter pictures for a Pulitzer, every picture must be published in print. At least it was back then. I'm not sure what the rules are now. So we had to take that to the publisher.
Well, what are some of the arguments against running, can you kind of lay out a little bit of that debate of,
Sure.
Are you protecting an audience from seeing what really happened, or what's the role there?
Well, I think when I think about protecting, and this is a conversation I have in my photojournalism class, there's a picture, I don't know if some of you remember, of an American soldier whose body was dragged through the streets in Somalia. Do you guys? Okay, and I always ask students, would you run this picture or would you not? And a lot of students say no. But President Clinton saw that photo and it changed policy, and our troops were pulled out. And I think that for this instance, this isn't something we would normally see in our country, and I think it hits home of the desperation of, a lot of the police officers were shooting dogs, so just randomly shooting. We did a story about that. People left their animals in cages, and they died in cages. But just having bodies, I think it shows the devastation of Katrina, and that was the argument for it. Do you show for the greater good and to tell the story, or do you protect people?
And have you ever argued on the side of protecting people? I mean, have there been images where you thought, it's an interesting question just as what your role is as a journalist and an editor, have you ever argued on the side of, no, that's going to be too much for the audience?
No.
How about, can I just throw that out to our others who are here just to see? Have you scaled back on something that you thought was too, either because you were protecting the audience or one of your subjects maybe in a film?
Absolutely.
And what's your reason for?
Well, my reason for it, for example, in this short film that I made, Room 10, which is,
we can show in just a second.
The brief story is I was working on a documentary in New Orleans about 18 months after the storm about the rebuilding of a restaurant, and across the street from that restaurant was an elementary school, which had been it's basically built on stilts, so none of the water that filled that area of the Treme neighborhood had gotten into this area. And the teacher had written on the board, today is August 29th, 2005. Some of you are doing well, some of you need to do better, let's work together and have a good year. Well, that was a day that never happened in that room because that was written on the Friday before the storm. The teacher had erased the board, had prepared for the next Monday, and that morning was the morning that the storm hit. And I just kind of stumbled into that room because it was in the school right across from where I was working. I stole the class roll off the desk, and then 8.5 years later went to find the kids that were on that list and made this little short film. And it was Room 10, 10 years after Room 10. It was a pretty interesting convergence of things. But within this group of kids, to answer your question, there was this one young man who after the storm, maybe 3-4 years after the storm, had just come home from church. His brother was on the front porch. A guy walked up to him and shot him in the face and killed him right there in front of his family, in front of everybody. And that was it. I mean, it was just, that was the long and short of the story. It was a fight over some counterfeit money that ended up with one guy shooting another guy in the face, and he died. And that was a big part of that kid's story. And in some ways, the crime that still exists in areas of New Orleans is a big part of the post-Katrina story. But I felt like if I put that story in the film, it was going to veer the story that we were telling off in such a direction that it would have done a disservice to the kid, to the story as a whole, and to what we were, you kind of have to set limits on your stories and where you're going to go. Because we could have found, I guess in instance, if I'd have put that in there, it would have appeared to, I felt, it would have appeared to the audience that I was making a larger statement about violence in that area or in that neighborhood or in that city, which I couldn't corroborate necessarily through other interviews, through other things. And so I didn't want to I was doing very much a part to the whole. And so everything that happened in that room, I was trying to draw a correlation out to what was going on in the city. And I felt like if I had that in there, that it would have been kind of a red herring in a way that would have detracted from, a different story that I was telling, or that would have made the place seem incredibly violent, and that would have marked it as opposed to having the other side of the story told. I still struggle with whether or not that was the right call, whether that was the right thing to do. In the end, I think it was, because I don't think that, just like for those kids, I don't think that, Katrina was a big part of their lives, but one of the cool things about talking to them now is that they don't allow it to define them necessarily. And I think defining this kid by the worst day of his life
unfair.
was unfair to the kid. But that was just a call I made. And I was working for Garden and Gun, so it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't like you're working for the Times. We didn't have a big fight over it.
I'll show, if it's all right with you, I'll just show a couple minutes of that
Sure,
room 10.
sure.
I didn't really think of nothing big because I'm 9, so they were like, get your clothes, pack your things, we're going by your grandmother's house. I was like, okay, well, what are we gonna do?
My family was like, a hurricane is coming, we have to evacuate. We really didn't know if we was staying there or coming right back. So we just had little bags of clothes with us.
When it really started, I didn't know what to do. I just seen my city get flooded. God dang, this New Orleans, and this happening here, you know what I'm saying?
I didn't even know it was a storm. I thought it was just raining. Till I come outside and a lot of water was out there, so we wound up leaving, then went to the Superdome.
I will honestly tell you, my mom, she didn't tell me how serious it was. Because at that moment, my mom wanted playful Jonathan instead of panicking Jonathan.
I remember waking up with my sister or whatever, and then we seeing a lot of water coming, and then it's kept building and kept building. We was like, oh my God, all this water. And then I remember us leaving the house or whatever, and we getting on a boat and going to the convention center. And I remember running off, and because I'm thinking I'm following my mama, but I'm following somebody else, and I was so scared, I almost lost my mind, but someone told me to turn around. I saw her she was looking scared or whatever, so it kind of made me scared. I'm sorry.
We all got together, we all went on the interstate, and we walked towards the convention center because they said buses were coming to take everyone away. And as we were sitting there, someone screamed, the water was coming. So me being a child, I just take off running as well. And I wound up tripping and falling. I had a huge gash under my chin because I was trampled. I thought I was lost because I didn't see my mama anymore. I ran away from my family, so where are they? I'm never gonna find them again.
My mom was like, I can't swim, but I'm gonna get through this. She said, stay close to me, Nikki. I'm holding on to her shirt. And I'm right there. And then I guess I just hit one stump that made me slip. And then all I remember is myself just going down, and my uncle pulled me out the water. And I was like, oh my God. I was like, oh my God, that could have been my life right there.
Then they had a guy who stole.
Stop there. I don't mean to stop right in the middle. It's such a moving piece, but room 10 on Garden and Gun, and you guys should watch the whole thing in its entirety. But it's so, I love the guy who's like, my mom didn't want, he wanted playful Jonathan, not panicking Jonathan. I love the insight they have into that moment, looking back.
Yeah, they were really more aware of what was going on, I think, than anybody gave him credit for. And then the next story he's about to tell is that his mom was a bus driver. She drove a city bus. And there was a guy that had basically taken over one of the buses. He had stolen it, and he was getting ready to get the hell out of New Orleans. And she stopped and stood in front of the bus. The guy had to slam on the brakes. And his mom went and basically said, I'm a bus driver. If you get stopped, the cops are going to arrest you for stealing that. But I have the credentials. I know what to tell them. So you let me drive the bus, and I'll put all these kids on here and all my family and everybody else, and you just sit in the back. and we'll get out of here. And she drove like 40 people out of New Orleans in that bus. So it's just incredible what happened and all these kids that were in that one little room, you know.
How many different little stories. So I'm curious with your experience too, because you are a filmmaker, documentary filmmaker. You don't think of yourself as a reporter necessarily, not at all.
Definitely not.
Yeah, and so what's, what's your goal going into storytelling, if it's not like, there's not the story, there's not a news story, a breaking story for you to tell. So what's your kind of goal, but also what's your preparation for that? Like, how do you know that you can tell that story?
Yeah, this story was just something that, it was just happenstance. I mean, I just literally happened to walk into that room. I happened to see that date on the board. And then in that moment, I thought this could be a story, even that long ago.
Mm-hmm.
I shot over an hour of footage inside the room. I was thinking about it. I took the class roll. I kept it on my office in Kennard Hall for 8 years, stuck to the wall. You just know, like for me as a filmmaker, you just know what's going to be compelling. Like that's compelling. This is an empty room, untouched. Books are still, it would be as if you all just stood up right now and walked away. I mean, like everything was exactly like that. Your pad would still be sitting right there on your desk. Your water bottle would still be sitting right there. Like that is compelling. What happened? That's just a basic question. Mm-hmm. What the hell happened to these kids? So I knew that would be a compelling story to tell. And then as we got closer to the 10th anniversary, I wanted to tell it all along and just never could quite. It's hard to find kids.
Pre-social media, there's not a trend.
Well, yeah, I mean, we did find a lot of them some of them through Facebook, and then you find some they don't want to talk, et cetera. So, but why tell it? I mean, you tell it because you can't not tell it. You tell it because, like, right. I wanted to know what happened to them because, right. like, it was chilling to be in that town. Mm-hmm. You've been in that town and you've seen all the piles of debris, all the ruined houses, all the places that were a year and a half after the storm that were still just in, I mean, the water had come, the water had gone, and the people that were there hadn't come back. And then you find this one piece that is completely unchanged. Everything else is a post-Katrina world except for this room mm-hmm. was still exactly the way it was. The clock had literally stopped. All the clocks in the school stopped at 5 minutes after 6 in the morning, which is when the power went out in New Orleans. So you just have to tell that story. Right. And so luckily, I mean, I was trying to get it in the Times Magazine because I thought, man, this would be a great Times Magazine story. Mm-hmm. So I went to a friend of mine, Kim Severson, that writes for the Times, and she took it to them and they turned it down, and then she took it to Garden and Gun. And they're not, we had to tell them, like, there aren't going to be any $10,000 dogs in this. They're not going to be, like, because, it's a great magazine. I love it. But they will sometimes, run these kind of very...
This isn't their sensibility.
This is not. But kudos to them for allowing us to really dig into this story and to pay for it to be done and to let us do it the way that we felt like we needed to do it. But the larger answer, too, though, is you tell this kind of story because... those of us that are here in Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, in this area that was truly affected by Katrina, we know that the storm isn't over even now. Like the legacy of that storm will not be over possibly in our lifetimes. For a lot of other people, it went away, months, maybe, however many months after the cameras left. It was just kind of like, oh, every now and then we read a story about Katrina. Every August we read a few more stories. For people like these kids, it's, they're trying not to let it define them, but they'll never escape it. This one girl says, closer to the end of the film, she says, like, I used to be this girl that would go after anything, that would, like, go after my dreams, that would try anything. And she goes, I just feel like now I'm lost. I feel like I'm back in that water, and I feel like that little girl that I used to be is gone. And that is, like, a heartbreaking thing to hear an 18-year-old girl say, mm-hmm. to hear that moment mm-hmm. stole her childhood, her future, her trajectory from her and set her off on a completely different path. And so for her, that moment, those few days after the storm will have forever shifted the trajectory of her life. And so it's a reminder to folks that it may be over for you, but it's not over for a lot of folks. This is a real struggle that continues every day. And so that's why you tell a story. That's why I told a story like that.
Right. Thank you. I was going to ask you about what you do when characters cry on camera, but I'm going to skip on to the next one. Maybe we'll get back to it. I always have questions about how people, when you're reporting, handling heavy emotion from people, and whether or not you show that, how much of that you show. I don't know that you have an answer to that, or if it's just...
You just laugh a lot. No, I'm kidding. You don't. You let them go. You just let them go.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm going to ask Nancy, do you want to run, do you want to introduce your sort of experience on
I'd
the
like to
coast?
introduce my experience.
Yes.
Do you have the pictures that I sent you?
Yes.
I was living in New Orleans with my husband at the time Katrina hit, but I was raised in Gulfport. And when I saw what had happened to my childhood home that my 80-year-old parents were living in at the time, my heart was tied to the Mississippi coast from then on. And most of what I have studied since then is about that. But this is my childhood home. And what was most remarkable that day is it was summertime, so the oak trees had leaves on them, and they were gone. And this is a tractor trailer. There were 4 tractor trailers on my parents' property.
And this is Gulfport, correct?
Mm-hmm. Gulfport. It's West Gulfport. And so much came up from the port of Gulfport and was deposited in West Gulfport. West Gulfport has absolutely not recovered in any way, shape, or form. This lot is still vacant. You see the big rolls of things? Actually, when Hurricane Camille hit in 1969, these rolls washed up. They were newsprint that was bound for the newspaper in Biloxi, and it never made it. So this is kind of what my home looked like. And I actually went in there looking for things. I should have realized that we had our lives, and that should have been the end of it, because I fell through what was the roof of our house. And I had to have surgery on my legs 4 years later. So it was a very stupid thing for a woman over 50 to do. So I have regretted that. I did get some things that are very precious to me that belonged to my parents, but it certainly wasn't worth it. So there you can see the rolls. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They washed up in Camille in 1969 as well.
And you were there, so you actually, I just learned this today. I didn't realize you were a young girl during Camille. You remember it?
The 2 defining moments on the Mississippi Gulf Coast are Hurricane Camille in 1969, which had a 17-foot storm surge. And then, of course, we thought nothing worse than that could ever happen. So people rebuilt, and that was 1969. I was in high school. And then my parents did rebuild, but we just thought that was a Category 5. There were only 2 Category 5s in history. It would never be that bad again. So Katrina, here comes Katrina. Only a Category 3. But it had a massive storm surge that was 28 feet high. And actually, it was 34 feet high, but 28 feet not accounting for the high tide. So that was much, much worse.
Question about rebuilding. In one of the things that came up in the anthology that just edited, the thing that struck me going back and reading, I'd gone back to all these blog entries basically from 2005, and these kind of day by day, I mean, these as real time as it was pretty much back then, reports. And it was amazing to me how many people were like, well, I can't wait to get back and rebuild. That impulse to want to do that, even though they hadn't even seen the destruction yet. And I'm wondering if back in '69, was that there? Like, do you remember the discussions of like, well, yes, we are rebuilding? Was that?
Right. And Camille was rebuildable.
Yeah.
Katrina was not. And the insurance has become so high along the Mississippi Gulf Coast that you almost can't afford it. So you can't afford to rebuild. Also, the building codes are calling for a much higher elevation of your house, and you almost get a house that's built on stilts. So not a lot of people have wanted that kind of house. So the building has gone farther north than away from the coastline.
So you just came back, you took a group of students down.
I did, and but some of them are in the audience, and I'd like to give them a lot of credit. And if we have time to roll all three, it would be great, and I'll keep my comments very, very brief about this. This is about a church that came back from disaster, but I do have an interesting story about this church as well.
It's strange when you look out at that water to think that there was a 27-foot tidal surge. When I was first ordained, the rule of the Episcopal Church was you would retire at 65. I was 64 when Katrina hit, and I knew I couldn't quit. All of the debris from the church and some apartments that were over there and all was blocking the road when I came down here after the storm. And we just put up a little plywood sign that said, "Church at 9:30, bring your chairs." And we stuck it against that tree right there, and people came, and we had a service out here on this property, and that's where we had the service. It was on CNN that morning, first Sunday after Katrina.
Why did you pick this particular Sunday?
We ain't gonna miss one.
Since I came in April of 1969, you haven't missed one.
He had been here in 1969 for 4 or 5 months, 4 months when Camille hit. And he put this church on his back and rebuilt it. And he rebuilt it not only physically, but also with the membership. Grew from about 100 members to over 700 members. And then Katrina hit, and he did the same thing.
So we just plugged on along until we got through it. I mean, it was long and hard, sure enough, but you know, the rewards were great, seeing the people and the progress and seeing them appreciating and enjoying what we together were doing here. You know, I am a person that kind of knows how to change a light bulb and knows how to, you know, fix a few things around, and so I always have.
That's just what I was talking about, that a lot of building has been away from the beach. I want to give credit to Ji Hoon Hao. Yes, please. And Serena Henderson, who also worked on this. And I'll have to give credit to my colleague, Professor Deb Winger, who actually was the editor on this piece. Father Beau was seen as a real hero of Camille in 1969. He actually held, this church was so badly damaged that he had to hold the services outside the first Sunday after Hurricane Camille. And that was he had been there 4 months as a new priest. And so he was about to announce his retirement when Hurricane Katrina hit. and he held services outside again on a Sunday. So he is beloved in Gulfport. Thank you for doing such a good job.
Yeah.
Okay, if I could just see one more.
Yeah. If you, and I'll ask you a question about covering this. Now, is this the version you wanted?
No, the other one. I don't know that we have time for this, so the other one.
Okay.
This is it, yes,
Okay.
When Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast in August 2005, thousands of people lost their homes. But one man kept his house and gained a badge of honor on that tragic day.
You know, I was in this house for every storm in my life, so the house was safe. But, you know, it wasn't safe for Katrina because nobody predicted a Katrina. But, you know, we put the sign up to let people know what happened down here. Because, you know, it's been 10 years and you got people from out of town walk by and they see all this vacant land, you know. All these were houses. You know, I had 500 houses disappear in this neighborhood. And this was one of the few, actually this was the last house standing to the east.
In communities all across the coast, people put up signs showing just how high the water was when Hurricane Katrina made landfall. And in a ceremony in Biloxi, visitors saw just how high the waters got during the destruction 10 years ago.
1, 2, 3.
You look at the Camille elevation mark and compare it with the Katrina elevation mark, we've seen that actually in our people's lifetimes that there is such a thing as having two disastrous storms within a lifetime.
It's hard to believe the water got as high as it did. You know, I got the sign right here, but if you look at the telephone pole across the street, see the blue circle? That's the same height. So to think the water was that deep in that street, and the street is above sea level to start with, so they figured about 28 feet right here.
In the decades since the storm, builders in the community are following much stricter guidelines to prepare for future flooding.
So today what our building and our code enforcement people and what our floodplain managers, their job is to make sure people are building back in a responsible manner, because we don't want to have to go through another Katrina. We know that we may go through another Katrina, but we want to minimize the risk.
With the new construction standards, Michael has finally finished rebuilding his home and is ready to party.
You know, I always said when I got the house finished, I was going to have a priest bless it and have a party. Well, Sunday we blessing the house, so it took 10 years, but we're getting it blessed and we're going to have a party.
No matter how high Mother Nature sets the bar, the people of the Mississippi Gulf Coast continue to surpass it. In Biloxi, Peyton Green, Newswatch 99.
And that was a story done by Peyton Green and Quentin Smith. I want to talk about something that this man said in his interview off camera. He said he has survivor's guilt because, and one reason he put up the sign was because people were wondering, well, your house stood, you were lucky. And he felt very, very guilty about the fact that his house stood, but you don't see the fact that there was 7, 8 feet of water in his house, and he took in 30 refugees that came in that day, and he doesn't really know who they were because you don't introduce yourself in a time like that when someone's house is falling and they come to your house and get in your second floor or your attic. But he said he really felt guilty about that. And that's kind of the thing you hear about World War II. The guys who came back, who didn't get killed, had survivor's guilt. And I'm wondering how many people along the coast kind of have that. And they may even have it in New Orleans as well. I don't know, because there were so many tales of devastation, so many tales of death, that to think that you might not have suffered as much as they did. It's kind of a communal thing. And I found that really interesting that he said that.
Was it, I mean, I'm sure it was difficult to go back down for the 10th anniversary, but were you, I mean, students did an amazing job with doing it and turning that around. What kind of sort of historical context did you either give them, or were they, you know, did they go down and kind of try to understand something that happened?
I'm glad you asked that. We had worked very closely, both Professor Winger and I, and we had actually worked during the summer times at WLOX, which is the television station on the coast. And our students have worked there as well. And they were absolutely insistent that the 10th anniversary be a looking forward. And I think all of our stories have that looking forward feel. And all of the celebrations that we attended had a looking forward, with full knowledge that the Mississippi Gulf Coast is Hurricane Alley. It has had so many, it's practically unbelievable. My father, before Katrina, had a T-shirt that said, "I survived," and it had all of the list of hurricanes that had hit the Mississippi Gulf Coast. So we know it will happen again. It will happen in Mississippi again. But the plans are to make it not so devastating the next time, with building much higher, back away from the coast, and more responsible building, and being aware of what might happen. So we went there with that that intention.
Well, that was some great work. Thank you, G, also for letting us share that. I was going to ask, this may be going too far afield, but one of the things that I noticed was absent in a lot of the 10th anniversary reporting was the BP oil spill coverage. I don't know that any of you noticed.
When I took a group to the Mississippi Gulf Coast to do a similar project, it was 1 year ago. The BP oil spill figured heavily in that, because a lot of people said the BP oil spill was worse.
Right.
Was much worse, because they couldn't control anything, and they had so much damage, particularly to tourism.
Right. Well, thank you all so much for sharing all your work on this. I will ask students if they have any questions for these guys, or actually I'd love to, and G, is Peyton here? Anybody else who went down this past
Serena
weekend?
is here as well, yeah.
Okay. I'm curious to ask you all sort of what your feelings were going down, and if you felt equipped going into it. Like, did you know, you were going, and it was a huge media event too, I'm assuming, on the Mississippi coast as well as New Orleans. Did you have any kind of trepidation about that, or some plan of action? How are you going to zoom in on some piece of that story? You can, either one of you, if you have an answer, you're welcome to. Mm-hmm. 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 That's great. Well, you did a really nice job. Gee, what about you? You weren't in this country, I don't think, when that happened. Wow. Mm-hmm. Wow. That's great. Well, we have a couple minutes for questions from, did you have I saw a hand raised, but feel free to ask questions, and if you guys don't mind answering them as well. I didn't give you a heads up that you'd be called on, but thank you. Yes.
Sure. We came, my husband and I came from New Orleans to Gulfport, and we headed north. And the day before, we were almost too late. It was the morning before, and the traffic was just terrible. Anyone who went through that, who rode out of New Orleans or out of the Mississippi coast with their parents, you will remember the traffic. You'll never forget it. I'm sorry, we went to Hattiesburg, which wasn't at all spared. 2/3 of Mississippi counties were disaster areas because Katrina was a tropical storm when it went over Oxford. That's how strong the thing was. So there was a disaster in most of Mississippi. So it wasn't pleasant to be there either. No water, no electricity, absolutely trapped by falling trees. So that's where we were.
I have a question actually too for any of you all that I remember, a lot of we've had a chance every year to kind of look back on Katrina and the coverage, and there were a lot of discussion about race and class and how things got covered and or not covered sort of appropriately, and like the looting versus people surviving and the racial images that were shown. Do you think, or did you notice, I don't know that you were following as much, but did you feel like the anniversary coverage was more sensitive to that, or was that not as much? I mean, we're at an even more tense point in the country these days, it would seem, around race issues than we were when Katrina hit. At least, I don't know. I don't know that you noticed a difference, or if it was something. And if any of you, if you don't have thoughts on it, don't manufacture an answer. But
I don't have anything to say.
No answer.
Yeah, I'm good.
Nancy, how about coverage of Mississippi versus New Orleans?
Biloxi is really the most diverse city on the coast, and I can't remember back 10 years ago to what the issues might have been, but I certainly was aware of them in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. And there was much discussion of particularly looting versus desperation. Mm-hmm. And if you were black, you were a looter. If you were white, you were in desperate need of supplies. So I do remember those elements and that controversy, mm-hmm. but I don't, for the life of me, have any impression of how it was covered in mm-hmm. the 10th anniversary.
I'll throw one thing out there, Cynthia, which is, the Gulf Coast is not just a black and white place. There's lots of other nationalities there, especially Vietnamese, mm-hmm. Which, I don't know if you guys know this, but if you eat a shrimp that comes out of the Gulf, there's basically an 80% chance that it was caught by someone that was either born in Vietnam or is the child of someone that was born in Vietnam. They came over after the fall of Saigon. They were, in a lot of ways, kind of adopted by the American government and put kind of all over the U.S. and then kind of ended up kind of all coalescing around the Gulf Coast because it was the lifestyle that they remembered and they were comfortable with from back in Vietnam. So pretty much from Biloxi, like all the way around to New Orleans, all the way down to Venice, really, there are Vietnamese families everywhere. And you think about those families that have come through having a country taken away from them, being sent away, being refugees from that, ending up in God knows where, finding their way down to the Gulf, getting hit by Katrina, then getting hit by the oil spill. I didn't hear very much about that, and I think it's a very underreported story as far as that goes. I think
there was a Vietnamese family in one of our stories. Unfortunately, I don't have it today, and I think they said things are not very good even to this day.
Yeah.
There's an excellent documentary that my New Orleans class folks watched. It's A Village Called Versailles. It's made by a filmmaker named Leo Chang, who is not Vietnamese. He's Asian American, but he was really interested in that story in particular, it's a beautiful documentary, and it really tracks sort of their, both their history, but they'd always existed very kind of marginally on the outskirts of cities, you know, and been very self-contained and prosperous within their own communities. You know, they'd built very, I'm sorry, I'm losing the words for it, but they kind of coexisted pretty happily, and then Katrina hit, and they were, you know, they didn't have the language skills they were not connected at all to kind of the government resources or even just the community around them. And there's an excellent, that documentary, if people are interested in this, it's called The Village Called Versailles, and it's really does a great job of tracking kind of almost like how an immigrant community become citizens that have to really fight, that have to become part of the political process, because after the storm, basically all of the, you know, debris from Katrina got dumped, and they were taking it, they happened to take it just sort of like right between New Orleans and where these people had lived and really thrived for a long time. And they suddenly were like, wait a second, like this can't be how we're rebuilt. We have to be part of the rebuilding process. So it's a really great story that documents that, but it is a very good point. It's not just black and white. It is much more diverse than it might seem if you just watch the images on TV. But well, any other questions from you all? Yes.
You guys talked about PTSD and survivor's guilt every year. Did you guys, for those who took the kids down there to do like their 10-year anniversary, did you guys warn the kids about the possibleness of what ended up in PTSD or survivor's guilt? How did you guys overcome that?
It's a good question.
That's a very good question, and we probably should have, because I myself had PTSD for at least 6 months, and the news media of New Orleans was particularly hard hit with all of the horrors that they saw. There was a photographer at the Times-Picayune who got in a lot of trouble when he flipped out. There were 2 anchor people in New Orleans who both had DUIs almost immediately after the storm, and they weren't drinkers. So that is a very important point that we should have addressed, because we were going to be dealing with people who probably still have nightmares, very bad thoughts about the storm.
Good question.
Yep. I'll add one quick thing to that, which is the kids that I talked to from room 10 that were, 7, 8 years old at the time. When I talked to several of them, they told me that was the first time they'd ever talked about it.
Wow. Wow.
They were like, I've never talked about this before, ever.
Wow.
So there's a real, you talk about an underserved population of people that need to be talking about these things. I mean, there are instances where people would, just burst into tears, like in the middle of a otherwise fairly innocuous kind of story, and then your question as an interview is, why is this happening? Why do you feel this way right now? Tell me about this. Where's this feeling coming from? And then I've never talked about this before. I've never talked to anybody about this before. And that is, that's just amazing. That's an amazing idea that you could have held on to that as a youngster for that long. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done there, obviously.
Yeah, did you have a question?
Mainly a question for Professor Steele. Could you talk about some of the difficulties that your reporters and photographers faced in just being able to move around a disaster area like that?
Well, obviously with the downed trees and buildings, but I think more for the staff was the emotional. Imagine being somewhere where it's completely black, no lights. You hear things at night. You're wondering if you're going to be safe or bit by something. One photographer had just won a Pulitzer for her coverage in Iraq, and here I am answering the phone at 2 o'clock in the morning just listening to her cry. That's all I could do was just listen and be there. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but it was just being there and being an ear and giving them some support of, maybe you need to come home and get some counseling and get some time off and decompress a little bit. and then send someone else out there because it was draining. They worked, they slept, they ate. I mean, and just carrying. Just one of the photographers was just terrified of driving with all that gas in the car, you know, wondering if she was going to be carjacked or hit, have an accident, and the car goes up in flames. So just everything came at them, you know. And we covered it for a year. We didn't just cover Katrina for a month. We covered it for a year. Yep.
Y'all all have very different stories. How did y'all each decide what story that you thought was the most important to tell going forward with the story again at that time?
I thought we needed to have real genuine people in our stories, and there were a lot of officials around who wanted to be on camera, so getting to the real people, those who went through it, was our challenge, and it was quite a challenge. So I would say that was our goal, and we didn't necessarily hit it all the time.
Just for the Dallas Morning News, we just covered everything. We had more than half our staff out there, so we relied on the reporters and the photographers to find the real people and report the real stories. And you know, we didn't even plan on doing a story about the animals, but that was such a problem with police officers just shooting animals, or animals starving, or people trying desperately to find their pets. So I mean, it came in every direction, you know, looting or finding food. I mean, they just covered everything. So the Dallas Morning News, their philosophy was give it all to the public. We didn't hold anything back. As soon as pictures came out, we edited them and put them back out. So we just wanted everybody to have access to everything.
And for me, I think I kind of answered your question earlier, but it was just, I mean, I probably, unlike these guys, you know, I'm not a journalist, so this story really just kind of found me in a weird way. I just happened to wander into that room, and I mean, honestly, I think my boss, Andy Harper's up here somewhere, but he can tell you that list of names that I took off of that desk has been on a thumbtack in my office for like 8 years, and you just look at them and you Google them occasionally, and you're just like, is this you? Is that, you know, who? And so it was just a deep curiosity and desire to know what happened to those kids.
Are all of them still in New Orleans?
Not all of them, and there were a lot of them we just did not find, and we had to use, you know, we employed stringers and other researchers and people to help us find these children. Some of them are in Houston, some are in Atlanta. Most of them stayed mostly in the Southeast, but a lot of them did return, and will tell stories about, you know, going to Pensacola, going to Chattanooga, going to Atlanta, going to, you know, different parts, you know, Crystal Springs, Mississippi, which is a hell of a change from New Orleans, and being the new kid in school. So you can imagine your town is destroyed, and now all of a sudden, you know, did anybody ever change schools when you were 8? You know, you're the new kid. That's not particularly easy. And there was a stigma against the New Orleans kids that came. So a lot of them did come back, but a lot of them stayed where they went.
Did anyone pass away?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of. No deaths that we found.
Any other questions? Last questions? Thank you guys so much for sharing all these
Thank you for your attention.